name is Dag Blanc. I'm the director of the Venum Center at Augustana College in Rock Island, Illinois. And I'd like to welcome you to this lecture. Of course, we live in difficult times when we have to socially isolate, but we also live in times when technology allows us to reach each other in new and very interesting ways. And at the Venum Center, we have lots of resources available online that people can access for their computers. But we also thought we would reach out to you with this talk and share with you some ideas about Sweden and the United States. I'm an historian, and I have worked for many years in different ways examining the relationship between Sweden and the United States. And today I'd like to share some thoughts and ideas with you about the relationship between Sweden and the United States. It's a lecture that I call Transatlantic Dreaming, Sweden and the United States since 1850. It will last between 30 and 40 minutes, and you can stop whenever you wish, and you can come back to it whenever you wish. That's the advantage of these taped lectures. Well, let's get going, shall we? See if I can fire up my PowerPoint presentation for you. I think it should be up now, and then I need to fix that as well. So, Transatlantic Dreaming, Sweden and the United States since 1850, roughly. The first aspect of the relationship between Sweden and the United States that I would like to talk about is the migration. Of course, there are many different ways in which Sweden and the US have interacted with each other and influenced each other, but the migration is a fundamental such relationship, and the migration has had long-lasting consequences when it comes to the relationship between the two countries. So let's start with that, and let's say something first about the basic facts of the migration, and then I'd like to highlight some dimensions of the Swedish migration to the United States since 1850, between 1850 and 1930, that big mass immigration of Swedes to the United States, and the consequences that that migration has had. As many of you know, between 1840 or 1930 or so, about 1.3 million Swedes migrated to the United States. The migration, this great transatlantic migration of Swedes to the US or to North America, actually, quite a few came to Canada, not as many, of course, but Canada was also a destination, and also a few to South America. Swedish migration to the New World, really. This was a part of a much larger European movement across the Atlantic from most, I should say, all European countries. Different countries had different degree or intensity of migration. Actually, the country that had the largest degree of migration, largest intensity of migration, is Ireland. Ireland, in relationship to its population, Ireland had an enormous out-migration to the United States. First there's Ireland, and then there's nothing, and then there's Norway and Sweden. Norway and Sweden also experienced heavy out-migration, heavy losses, if you like, heavy population losses. And for Sweden, we estimate that between 1840 and 1930, about 1.3 million individuals moved to the US, as I said. The reasons behind this Swedish migration to the US is similar. The reasons are similar to reasons you find in other countries, essentially social and economic reasons. It's a part of the kind of social and economic dislocation processes that are going on in the 19th century and early 20th century, having to do with industrialization, urbanization, and modernization. Just some basic numbers here. The population of Sweden grew rapidly during this time. In 1800, there were 2.3 million Swedes in Sweden, and in 1900, a century later, 5.1 million Swedes. Almost a doubling of the population, or more than a doubling of the population. And that, of course, created an enormous pressure on the available resources in the country, the economic resources in the country. And with the growth of the population, there was also a growth of the poorer strata of the population. Some people got poorer and poorer. It's kind of a downward social mobility that was taking place. And the migration to the United States was one way of avoiding these factors and to seek better economic and social opportunities elsewhere. And luckily for the Swedes, the United States was available, and the United States was a country which was growing, and the United States was expanding westwards, of course, during the 19th century, and the United States had needed people. And the United States had fairly open immigration legislation, open immigration rules, in particular towards Europeans, and in particular towards Northern Europeans. So the Swedes were very much beneficiaries of the need for immigrants in the United States. So even though the population, as you can see, grew more than doubled, you have to also factor in that over 1 million Swedes had left. So you get a sense of these changes, these social demographic changes. There were also some political and religious reasons. Other countries in Europe had larger economic, political, and religious reasons for the migration to the world. In Sweden, they were not as common or as prominent as they were, for example, in Germany and other countries, but some existed. We had some religiously motivated migration. Perhaps the best known is the group migration that landed in Bishop Hill, Illinois, not too far away from where the Swenson Center is located in Rock Island. Very early in the 1840s, about 1,000 individuals from central Sweden moved to Bishop Hill, Illinois, to create a utopian religious colony where they could live, or wanted to live according to their faith, under the leadership of a very charismatic religious leader, Eric Jansson. But by and large, religious dissent was not a huge factor. Same thing with politically motivated migration. There were some persons who left Sweden for political reasons. Some of them were connected to the labor movement, the growing labor movement in Sweden, having to do with strikes and so forth at the beginning of the 20th century. So we have some of religious and some political dissent, if you like, but mostly social and economic reasons, mostly a migration to the United States to try to seek better economic opportunities for yourself and for your family. And it was the younger strata of the population that moved predominantly, especially in the beginning, or towards the end of the migration period. And they were, of course, particularly vulnerable for these dislocations that were going on. Once in America, the Swedes settled in the beginning in the Midwest. The Midwest became the heartlands, shall we say, of Swedish America, with early settlements in Illinois, Western Illinois, around Bishop Hill, for example, but also or some very early settlements in Iowa, but eventually also in Minnesota and in Iowa and Nebraska, Kansas. Eventually, during the 19th century, this grows, this settlement pattern changes, and it comes to include the east and west coasts as well. There's a small but interesting migration to the south. The only substantial settlements in the south were in Texas, where the Swedes, some Swedes were quite successful in Texas. The South in general, the American South in general, did not receive a great number of immigrants as a whole. Texas was an exception there. Lots of German settlements in Texas as well, and some Swedish settlements in Texas. Very interesting, very different kind of groups, Swedish cotton farmers, and also some slave owners. But by 1910, you can see that 54% of the Swedish Americans in 1910 were in the Midwest, with Minnesota and Illinois as the largest states, and Chicago and the Twin Cities, the big urban settlements, but other cities as well. 15% could be found on the East Coast in New England and in New York. Worcester, Massachusetts became a big settlement area also, the industries in Worcester. And about 10% were found on the West Coast in Washington, California in particular, in those two states. The Seattle-Tacoma area becomes a big Swedish and Scandinavian settlement. It should be noted that in many places, Swedes and in particular Norwegians, the other big Scandinavian immigrants, lived fairly close to each other. That's the case, for example, in Minnesota. Chicago became the largest urban settlement in the United States. It actually became the second largest Swedish city in the world around the turn of the century. Stockholm was number one, and then came Chicago, and then came Göteborg, Gothenburg. So, and this movement toward the cities, of course, followed the general tendency in the United States as urbanization increased, industrialization increased towards the end of the 19th century, and the Swedes were also a part of that. So there's a movement from the initial rural settlements and farming areas to the growing cities, and Swedish Americans became a part of the rapidly growing and industrial economy in the United States, with cities like Chicago growing tremendously in the span of, say, 50 years, and other cities as well. So Swedes were a part of that industrial economy that needed immigrants, needed people from wherever, and many immigrants from Europe came, of course, among them the Swedes. Among these Swedish Americans, a community is established. We talk about the Swedish American community, Svensk America, a sense of belonging, a sense of togetherness among Swedish Americans. It can be described in many different ways, and how large was it, and so forth. It's clear that there were lots of organizations. We often speak of these organizations that founded the basis for the Swedish American. We had religious and secular organizations, for example. We had a number of denominations, Swedish denominations founded. The largest of all denominations and the largest Swedish American organization at all was the Augustana Synod, the Lutheran Augustana Synod, the kind of continuation of the Church of Sweden in the United States, founded by Swedish ministers who had emigrated early with parishioners. A number of other religious groups also emerged, the Mission Covenant Church, for example, Baptists and Methodists, and others. But the Augustana Synod was by far the largest and the most dominant. And then we had a number of secular organizations. We had the orders, the Vasa Order, the Order of Svitjag, and all kinds of clubs and associations throughout Swedish America, throughout America. Many of these organizations, secular organizations, were in the cities of Chicago and the Twin Cities of Seattle and New York. There were also a number of cultural institutions founded. Some of these secular organizations were specific cultural institutions. There were a number of institutions of higher learning, the colleges, Swedish American colleges and academies were founded. Augustana College in Illinois, Gustavus Adolphus in Minnesota, Bethany in Kansas, Uppsala College in Jersey. And they all, together with a very large Swedish American press. Swedes, by and large, were literate as they emigrated. They knew how to read and to some degree to write. And they were used to reading. So immediately upon arrival, lots of newspapers were established. And there was a market for reading. These newspapers also printed books, and kind of a literary life emerged among Swedish Americans. And these newspapers became very important for the preservation of a sense of community, preservation of a sense of Swedishness, and for the development of a Swedish American identity. There was a lot of discussion of what it meant to be Swedish American. Now that we are in America, we are not Sweden, we're different from Sweden, but we're also different from America. These cultural institutions, the colleges, the newspapers, and the churches and other organizations, many of them dealt with these questions around the turn of the century, 1900, what it meant to be Swedish, a Swedish American identity. one part of the Swedish American identity, the Swedish American sense of distinctiveness, was the important was to establish a sense of history, a sense of belonging, a sense of long presence in the United States. You can see that among all immigrant groups, actually. The United States is a relatively young country in comparison to many European countries, established in 1776. And to have an early presence becomes very important. Who was there first, so to speak? And among these immigrant groups, especially as they come and try to integrate, try to find a space in the new country, to claim a long presence in the new adopted homeland becomes very important. You can see that among all groups that they try to trace themselves back to early persons who had participated, lived in the United States, or what had becomes the United States at the colonial time, of course. The English, who were very early, of course, during the colonial era, they have an advantage there. But the Swedes, of course, had a colonial presence in the so-called New Sweden colony in the middle of the 17th century, established in 1638 and lost in 1655 around the Delaware River on the east coast, around the states of Delaware and Philadelphia and Wilmington and so forth. That was a rather unsuccessful colony that Sweden sought to establish, like other European countries in the 17th century did. But it became very important for the Swedish Americans of the 19th century and the 20th century to point to this colonial presence, that there was a presence already before 1776, only a few years after the English had arrived to Virginia and to Massachusetts, to New England. So this New Sweden colony has been celebrated, and one could say perhaps even over-celebrated a number of times, pointing to a Swedish presence there, and for the Swedish Americans of the 19th century, trying to establish a continuity between themselves as the 19th century Swedish Americans and these 17th century, but that what they called them Swedish Americans, but they weren't quite Swedish Americans in the same way. But this link, but there was really no link between these two population groups. But for the Swedish Americans, it became important to do that. So then you could trace yourself back to the colonial era and to the 1630s, which is pretty good. But the Swedes and the Norwegians and the Scandinavians, they could trace their presence in North America back even further, they argue, to the Vikings. And the Vikings, of course, had visited the New World around the year 1000. The Icelandic sagas, several Icelandic sagas speak of journeys west. First, the Vikings had, of course, migrated from Norway and Scandinavia to Iceland and settled Iceland. And then further on to Greenland, and there were some settlements on the coasts of Greenland, and then from Greenland also to North America. And the sagas speak of that. They speak of a place called Vineland, where they also speak of encountering native peoples there. They speak of settlements. It was unclear exactly where Vineland was, and there was a lot of discussion about that, if this actually had happened. And if it had happened, as many argued, where was it? And it wasn't really until the 1960s that archaeological evidence was found suggesting that there had been Scandinavian settlements around that time, around the year 1000, in Newfoundland, in Canada, on the Canadian East Coast. There, archaeologists have found remnants of those settlements. But these settlements never became permanent and never really left an imprint on subsequent North American history. But it is likely, it's probable, clear that there were some Scandinavians there, probably, or that they were there. But this Viking presence became very influential in these discussions among Swedish Americans in the 19th century, and discussions of how long they had stayed and where they had been continued. And in 1898, a rune stone was discovered in Minnesota, in like the little town of Kensington, Minnesota. And this is the rune stone, the so-called Kensington rune stone, on which it says in runic inscription that a band of Scandinavian Swedes and Norwegians had camped at this place in 1362, and that they had come to this place, had come west from Vineland, from these settlements on the east. This runestone has been the subject of enormous controversy, and all serious scholars have dismissed it. It is not an inscription from 1362, it's dated to 1362. All scholars say it's an inscription from the 19th century. Someone, Swedish American at the time, made this runestone to claim that Scandinavians had been there in 1362 to establish an early presence. And there are still some people who believe in this, but the scholarly evidence is overwhelming in favor of this being a 19th century inscription. But it shows the importance of being firsting, as some historians call it. And the Kensington runestone and the whole Vikings, the whole discussion about Viking presence is part of that. And we can see here, to the right, we see a picture of the Minnesota Pavilion at the New York's World Fair in 1964-65, where the Viking theme became very prominent. This controversial runestone, which had been dismissed many times by them, was transported to New York and was put on display in the Minnesota Pavilion. And out front, you see the big statue of the Viking, Big Ole, as he was called, and to suggest that here in Minnesota we had European presence already in 1360, so that Minnesota became the birthplace of America, not New England, not Virginia. Minnesota is the birthplace of America. And you can see then the Big Ole to the left in Alexandria, Minnesota, not far away from found. And there, Alexandria is the birthplace of America. So the Vikings play a very important role, and there's a lot of discussion about the Vikings and a lot of interest in the Vikings, and suggesting that they provide the Scandinavians, as both Norwegians and Swedes here, with a link to being first, to legitimacy and to early presence in North America. And the Vikings, of course, continue to attract our attention, as you know, in popular culture, in movies, TV series, and so forth. And I'm going to show you now a trailer from the film The Norseman from 1978, which picks up exactly on this theme, that these sturdy Northerners, Vikings, had been first in North America. You can see how this plays out in this 2.5-minute trailer.
As early as the year 793 AD, a lusty horde of blonde giants with an African slave began to boldly sail these seas. Row! Braving wild winds and waves and warnings of fearful death, they turned their eyes westward, beyond the setting sun.
Praise be to our God, Odin, for we have found the new land of the west. To Odin! To Odin! Odin!
The new land they named Vineland. We call it America. These men from Norway gave history one of the greatest warriors it has ever known. And he was called a Norseman. The Norseman stars Lee Majors, Cornell Wilde, Mel Ferrer, Susie Coelho, Jack Elam, and Deacon Jones. This is the story of the men who discovered America 6 centuries before Columbus and encountered on its eastern shores the fierce Iroquois Indians. Charles B. Pierce's The Norseman.
Soon coming to a theater near you. Yes, and you could hear the trailer 6 centuries before Columbus, the Norseman were here. This is probably not one of the best films ever made. I think it's more interesting for this theme that it takes up. And there are many Viking films, as you may know. We even had at Augustana a few years ago a bad Viking film festival, and so I've seen some of them. And some are pretty bad, actually. Some are better. So this is just to suggest that this significance of history, significance of creating a long presence in the new land, and using history to legitimize your claim in the new land. And not unique to Scandinavians or to Swedes. It happens among all groups. You can see, for example, in the late 19th century in Chicago, in parks, statues were erected of prominent members from the many different immigrant groups in Chicago. Chicago was, of course, a city with immigration from all over Europe, and different groups wanted to put up a representative of their own country. And many groups did that, and Kosciuszko came to represent the Polish group, for example, Garibaldi, and so forth. And there's a sense of showing who you are and trying to find an early presence in the new land. And the Vikings served that role and keeps on serving that role, I would like to say, for Swedish Americans and for Scandinavian Americans. Another important factor regarding the migration is that not everybody stayed. There was a significant return migration to Sweden. This is also true with other groups, and Sweden actually had a lower rate of return migration than the other countries. We estimate that during the era of mass immigration there from 1840 to 1930, that almost century, about 18% of those who would come to the United States returned. Some after a short period of time, some after a much longer period of time. It's hard to say exactly, but they were in America and they came back. And there were many reasons for that, obviously. Some who would come to improve their economic situation, to find money, make money, and were successful in that and were able to return and use that money to buy a farm maybe or start a business or something like that. But these returnees became very important in creating strong links between Sweden and the United States. There were all the migrants, most of the migrants, many would write letters back. And awareness was created in 19th century Sweden of the United States through the migrants. And these returnees provided an even stronger link to the United States. And many of them returned to smaller towns and rural areas. And in the 1920s and 30s and so forth, if you visited a small Swedish town, it would always be a Swedish American. There was the minister, and there was the grocery store owner, and the carpenter, and the Swedish American. They became a part of the local culture. And people were aware of them and people knew, almost everybody had relatives or friends who had been in America, who were in America at the time. So this return migration was very important in bringing an awareness of the United States to Sweden, to rural Sweden often, and to Swedes who were among the lower strata of the population even. To them, America was a household world. To the elite in Stockholm or Gothenburg, for example, who did not need to emigrate for economic reasons, far better off. Their ties with America were much weaker, one could say. So the returnees became very important in paving the ground, preparing the ground for an awareness of the United States in Sweden. And they brought things back. I mean, they brought back money, they brought back new ideas, new technologies, and so forth. So the return migration is very interesting. So far, it's a little bit understudied. I think we need more work on the consequences, long-term consequences of the return migration. But they really formed information channels, these migrants and the returnees, information channels bridging the Atlantic, lots of information and ideas and people flowing back and forth between Sweden and the United States in the 19th and 20th century, linking the countries together in a very interesting way. So the migration then is very important in these relations between the two countries, in that they create this closeness between the countries and these links. And there's a long-term effect here, one can say. There are long-term consequences, even though the migration, of course, now is over. It ends really by the end of the 1920s. The US starts limiting immigration in the early 1920s, and then the Great Depression, of course, stops the migration. But even so, and now today, Swedish Americans are in the third, fourth, fifth generation, and so forth. And in Sweden, most relatives are more distant, but even so, the migration still is important. The publication of novels, the new novel that came out here a couple of years ago, called Sweet Hollow, that talks about Swedes living in Sweet Hollow in St. Paul, Minnesota, became a tremendous bestseller. So the interest in the migration is still very, very strong in Sweden. And so the migration is a really important factor if you want to understand the different types of relationships that have existed between Sweden and the United States. So that's the first word, M word, migration, that is important migration between the two countries, mostly to the United States, but also back in the return migration that we need to consider when we think about how the countries have related to each other. The second M word, if migration then is the first one, the second M word is modern or modernity. Very different word. But modern America and modern Sweden, they have related to each other, one can say. They have helped shape images of Sweden in the United States and of the United States in Sweden. We often say that the United States, America, is a source of modernity. America is the most modern country. I've been to America and I've seen the future. And lots of modern influences have come from the United States back to Europe or in this case to Sweden. In terms, for example, technology, consumption patterns, lifestyles, modern lifestyle. Sometimes we talk about it as a kind of an Americanization, but I think modernity, this modern notion of modern America has been very important and has resonated very strongly in Sweden. For example, here's the Venum Center in Stockholm, one of the very first skyscrapers built in Stockholm on the outskirts of town. And this became a hotel partly for visiting scholars at the different universities in Stockholm. And most of those visiting scholars were from the United States. The United States is such an important country when it comes to academic work and research. And when this was opened in the late 1950s, the newspapers speak of this as a home for geniuses. This is where the geniuses live from abroad. They all come from abroad to Sweden, and they link us to the greater world. And interestingly enough, they are Americans. Almost all of these researchers are American. So America is very much strongly associated with future in terms of research, all the interesting research pointed in the future. Much of it comes from the United States, the modernity. But they write, the newspapers write about this building itself. I mean, there were no skyscrapers in Stockholm at the time. And the resonance with the US is very strong, just like in New York, just like in Chicago. And interesting enough, also, I think one can probably find the first known celebration of Halloween in this building, because some kids of the American guest researchers, of course, celebrated Halloween. And Swedish newspapers note this, spökfest, a ghost party. They talk about that in spökfest. And they were not familiar with Halloween at that time. Since then, Halloween has come to Sweden, and we celebrate also Halloween. But this is the modernity in terms of the buildings here, the skyscrapers, and also in terms of academic work and research. The modern world is where research plays such an important role. Consumption is another, of course, very important element of our image of the United States here, Sweden, and this is an ad from NK, the big department store, the most exclusive department store in Stockholm. Lita på cowboys, de använder denim jeans. Trust cowboys, they use denim jeans. This is when jeans were introduced in Sweden. And there was a big fair or exhibition at NK called Klart California. We're ready for California. This is in 1947. The war is over now, and it's possible to travel again to the US, and all kinds of goods and consumption items are now coming from the United States. And here's the ad. Again, trust cowboys. They use denim jeans now at NK. Although delayed for this exhibit, they have finally arrived. Dessa klämmiga långpants. These very nice long pants in incredibly durable, specially woven blue denim jeans, and then they give the pronunciation even. Jeans has the inimitable American fit in the waist. They're snug fitting. That English word is used. Snug fitting, yet very comfortable. No wonder they are the favorites with cowboys. A very strong association with cowboys. Colleagues in Denmark tell me that in Denmark they are sometimes referred to as cowboy byxor, cowboy pants, even still today. So the American West and cowboys and jeans. So jeans become very, very popular, blue jeans. And it can serve as a symbol for the kind of consumption society that derives from the US. The refrigerator and the kitchen, modern kitchen, and so forth. And McDonald's, of course. This is an ad from a bus in Stockholm in 1974 when the first McDonald's restaurant opened in Sweden at Kungsgatan 4, and then came the second one shortly after at Sveavägen 71, as you can see there. McDonald's, Sweden was one of the first countries in Europe to have a McDonald's, actually. Sweden is a relatively small country, homogeneous, and lots of consumption here. So many companies, I think, use Sweden as a test market. And you can see in 1974, a Big Mac went for $4.75. $4.75 today, I think it goes for 30 Swedish crowns. But that's another element, another aspect of consumption. Then our interest in modern America was also linked to two individuals, Alva and Gunnar Myrdal, who were academics and politicians connected to the modern Sweden, the building of the welfare state that became so prominent in Sweden in the 1930s and 40s and 50s and on. And they very early came to the United States, actually in 1929, as Rockefeller Fellows, a scholarship from the Rockefeller Foundation, and became incredibly influenced by the United States. Alva Myrdal, she worked in psychology and education, and she was very much taken by the American school system and wrote in 1941 that it is vital for our nation to get strong impulses from the new American education ideas that she considered far better than the Swedish schools. The Swedish school was too segregated, students were divided, and instead to have a common school to hold students together as they did in the United States, in the high schools, for example. That was her ideal. And she was very active after the war in the big educational reforms in Sweden, the School Commission in the late 1940s, which changed the Swedish schools fundamentally. And many of the ideas that came into the Swedish school, new Swedish school, were American, associated with the reform pedagogical ideas of John Dewey, among others. And Alva Myrdal was very interested in them. And they had lived, both of the Myrdals had lived in the United States in the late 1930s. And Gunnar Myrdal had been invited to write an incredibly influential book called An American Dilemma, which is a study of American race relations. The Carnegie Foundation invited him to head a team of scholars to study, examine race relations in the United States in the 1930s and 40s. And that book is still a classic, I think, in terms of American studies in American race relations. And so they lived there and they knew America very well. And Gunnar Myrdal in 1970 said that America, the New World, made an extraordinarily strong impression. We have deeply identified with America. And we deeply identified with America and have always retained that affiliation. This was in the 1970s during the Vietnam War, when Sweden was quite critical of the war, but still, and Myrdal was too, but still he said that that's one thing, but America as a country, the United States as a country, that's something very different. And he was always very influenced by it and argued for continued orientation, Swedish orientation towards America. And it was the kind of modern aspect of the U.S. that attracted them. And here they are on their way to the United States in 1938, I think. They are Gunnar and Alva and their 3 children are boarding the train in Stockholm, I think, to take the boat from Gothenburg to New York. And then politically, of course, Sweden is very interested in the United States. Of course, the U.S. is the superpower, and we have to relate to the United States. And some presidential visits are, of course, very important. Sweden's had one official visit of a U.S. president, and that was President Obama, who came to Sweden in 2013. No official visit by a U.S. president had taken place before that. Here is the front page of the leading Swedish newspaper, Dagens Nyheter, and you can see that welcome to little USA, Mr. President, suggesting that Sweden is very much oriented towards the United States. And there was a great rejoicement, actually, that President Obama came to Sweden. Sweden had felt, couldn't we get a presidential visit, had hoped for a presidential visit, but finally it came. And I remember it very well. I was a part of commenting on news media here in Sweden about what this meant, and we felt validated almost. So an American president has visited us and spoken very positively of us. And that was even better, of course. So it shows how important the United States is to us. Swedish modernity in America, this was American modernity for Sweden, but Swedish modernity in America, the modern Swedish welfare state, is also an interesting aspect here. And here's the New York's World Fair from 1939, when modern Sweden was first presented in a large scale in the United States. The reform movement that took place in Sweden in the 1930s and has gone on ever since, the kind of modern Swedish welfare state. And the suburb of Vällingby opened in the late 1950s with modern buildings and a modern shopping center and subway and so forth, became an emblematic of modern Sweden. And there were many, many foreign visitors who came to see this social experiment, as it was sometimes described, and many Americans, many urban planners and architects came to Vällingby. I have myself met an American architect who said, "Oh yes, Sweden, yes, you're from Sweden. Vällingby, yes, that was very important for us. We have been to Vällingby and we have seen the future." So in a similar way that the United States was the future, here we can see the modern Sweden, the attempts to create modern Sweden parallels that. And that's why these two modernities resonate with each other. The attempts to reform, especially the attempts after the Depression with the FDR and the New Deal, and then similarly at the same time, the Swedish Social Democrats set out to reform Sweden, the people's home, the folkhem. But there are also commercial aspects of modern Sweden that have done well in the United States. Volvo, for example, the Swedish car. Here's an ad for Volvo in the US in 1958. And today, I think maybe one of the most popular and best known products from Sweden is IKEA. Has been tremendously successful in the US. Here you can see even President Lincoln goes to IKEA when the IKEA store in Washington opened. And the Swedish experiment, so to speak, from the 1930s was presented in a book called Sweden, the Middle Way, The Story of a Constructive Compromise Between Socialism and Capitalism by Marx Childs. And that book became a tremendous bestseller in the US and also elsewhere it was read. And it presented this modern Sweden to an American readership, and it made a big impression in the United States. Franklin Roosevelt himself at a press conference in 1936 had read it, and he said I was tremendously interested in what they had done in Scandinavia. In Sweden, for example, you have a royal family and a socialist government, a capitalist system, all working happily side by side. So this kind of middle way between capitalism and this communism has been this kind of emblematic part of the Swedish model, and was very popular in the United States in the 1950s in particular. There was also critique of it, of course, that it was to the left, and it was a strong government, strong public sector. Not everybody wanted it. And President Eisenhower himself in 1960 warned against the socialist philosophy of Sweden and suggested that it had resulted in high rates of suicide and also drunkenness. So his message was, now Sweden had been very popular here for a long time. Don't go that route because it leads to suicide and drunkenness. So on the more conservative side in the US, of course, Sweden becomes a bad example. But on the liberal and more progressive side in the United States, Sweden becomes a positive example. And the suicides, for example, there was a lot of discussion about are the Swedish suicide rate higher than others, and has to do with how you count. And Eisenhower himself, when he visited Sweden after he left office, actually kind of apologized and said, I was misinformed about those numbers. You don't have higher suicide rates than other countries. But this image has stuck, and here's a little clip or dialogue from the Frasier, the sitcom, if you remember Frasier, the psychiatrist, and his son is asking, what you're doing there, Frasier? And he says, I'm trying to figure out this chair from Stockholm Design, presumably IKEA, Swedish furniture store, that he's just bought. And he says, the instruction booklet alone would account for the high Swedish suicide rate. If you've been to IKEA ever tried to put together the furniture, you know how difficult that is. And so, but these suicides come back. So that becomes a part of American image of Sweden. Another part, of course, is another S word if suicide is fun, sex, and the Swedish Sin. Here is a number of Swedish films came to the US in the 1950s and 60s, kind of risque and were sometimes caught by American censorship authorities. But here's one, Summer with Monica, by Ingmar Bergman, actually the famous Swedish film. You can see that it is portrayed here as she's naughty and 19. The devil controls her by radar. Monica, the story of a bad girl. Woody Allen writes in his autobiography that was one of the first foreign films he saw, and it was by Bergman. And of course, Allen was very influenced by Bergman. But when he was a young teenager, he didn't know that it was Bergman. He just wanted to see a film where a woman without clothes swam in a lake, which you can see in the film. Compared to what we see today on television and film, it's nothing. But Sweden was in the forefront of more outspoken sexuality on the screen. And Summer with Monica, made by Ingmar Bergman, this very influential film director. Here he is on cover by Time magazine in 1960. Is an example of that, of the American view of Sweden. And it also is linked, I think, to the more modern society, a more modern view, perhaps, on different attitudes. So I think we're coming to an end here, so migration and modernity is the message I want to leave you with. The first factor here is the fact that there was an important migration between Sweden and the United States. And those links are very durable, and they still exist, and they still continue to inform the relationship. And the second, modernity, modern Sweden, modern America, the welfare state. Think of Bernie Sanders' interest in Scandinavia and in Sweden today. That also continues. And the Swedish interest in certain modern aspects of the United States technology, pedagogical reform, consumption, and so forth. So there are those two, that modernity, I think, is also very important. Then there are many, many other types of relations as well that we can come back to in other lectures. I will end with this picture of kings and presidents, the official, very official relations, where the president here is President Obama with the Swedish royal couple visiting Sweden in 2013, and the Swedish royal couple visiting President George W. Bush and his wife Laura in 2006 from the White House. So those are the more traditional types of relations also that are also important and interesting perspective. I think I will stop here. I thank you for your attention. I hope you are keeping safe, and I hope you're holding up well and observing all the rules and regulations that we need to do during these difficult times. But if we do that, we will come through this together, I think, and we will be able to meet each other in person soon, and you will be able to come and visit us at the Venum Center and continue to talk with us among yourselves about different types of relations between Sweden and the United States. Thank you for listening, and stay safe.